So I'm not a great fan of doing year-end videos because they tend to be a bit samey. You know, if you're betting or you're Betfair trading or you're doing anything in sports markets, they tend to follow a regular cycle. So there's generally not much to talk about because the cycle is the same every year. However, 2020 was obviously different, and I think there are some important lessons to take out of it. Please like and comment on this video. That will allow me to produce better quality videos and more of them. And if you're interested in learning from somebody that's been doing this for over 20 years, then subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon if you want notification of new videos as they're released. So I hope that 2020 was okay to you. Obviously, it was a challenging year, I think is the word that people often use. And I hope it hasn't affected you adversely too much and that you're safe and all of those sort of things. Hopefully 2021 is going to be a lot better. But 2020 was the 20th year that I have actively been trading, and I am absolutely amazed that I am still here. And I don't say that for any other reason other than when I first started doing this, I wouldn't have given myself, if you'd have said I'd be doing this 20 years later, I wouldn't have imagined it. But my approach has progressed over a large number of years. And the first year that I ever traded full-time on Betfair is still my worst year. I have never done worse than that first year. It's been an upward progress from there. But it's interesting because a lot of my focus has shifted over the years from being a purely mechanical, methodical approach, looking at models and trying to figure out where I can get an edge in the market, to more sort of slightly ethereal side of things, such as looking at behavioral biases in the market and stuff like that. So, but you know, typically my progress over a large number of years has been very small and incremental. And that's why I think there's hope for everybody. Because when I started, I was on small stakes and not doing a great deal. And just gradually over a period of time, I've just slowly, incrementally got better and better to the point where I am now. And I actually had a really good 2020. But part of that is down to the unusual nature of the year, which we'll talk about in a second. But there were also some exceptional moments within the year that you can't take on a like-for-like basis, that they're not going to reoccur in 2021. And who really knows how 2021 is going to go, but there was a lot of things to learn from 2020. So typically my cycle is going to be a little bit different from yours because you obviously trade different sports and, you have different priorities, different times of the year. But typically peak season for me sort of runs from March until mid-November. And no matter how hard I work in that December to February period, I could, work 48 hours a day and I still wouldn't be able to beat what I can do in the summer. So I've taken this attitude that I have a quieter time at that time of year, start new projects, work on new things, and so on. It's typically the year really kicks in for me in March. And obviously the big thing for me being on horse racing is Cheltenham in March. That is one of the big events. And it didn't look as though Cheltenham was going to go ahead this year. Some of the busiest Cheltenham markets in the run-up to Cheltenham were the Will Racing go-ahead markets. But Cheltenham did go ahead, and ultimately it went pretty well for me. It was a great start to what could and should have been a decent year. But obviously, part of the reason that Cheltenham may not have gone ahead is because the pandemic was just beginning to take a grip at that particular moment in time. When I was checking for stats around this particular video, it was interesting because there was a sort of, people were worrying about the fact that the number of cases had risen to 58. And you look back at that and you sort of think, if I told you there were 50,000 in one day, then you may reappraise just how worried you were when there were just 58. But of course, I don't want to talk and labour too much on about all of that, because we all know what has happened and how everything is going from that particular perspective. But Cheltenham went pretty well for me, and I'm always pleased, the thing that I did that was special, well, I did sort of two special things at Cheltenham this year. For the first time ever, I managed to get £1,000 on the Gold Cup pre-off, which is the first time I've managed to do that. It's taken quite a large number of years, and I've had so many near misses. It was great to finally put that to bed. But I also managed to win on all 28 races, trading manually at Cheltenham. I did have automation running as well, which you need to add on top of this total. But being able to trade all 28 manually is something that I have done before. The last time I did it, I actually did it on BetDAC in 2017. So to be able to do it again in 2020 was one hell of an achievement. And the reason that I like doing that and showing you these things is because that really throws into sharp focus the benefit of trading. So, even if you're backing or laying, even if you're laying at large odds, to be able to do 28 in a row and not have a single losing one within an entire week is quite an achievement. But of course, it is perfectly possible with trading because of the way that you trade. You still need a little bit of luck. So if you look at the entire list of all the races that I traded, there was one race where I only made about £11, and that was where it all sort of went wrong, but I still managed to get a profit out of it. So you need a little bit of luck to be able to do 28 in a row. But nonetheless, when I first started doing this, people were saying it was impossible. 5 years in, people were finding reasons as to why that it still wasn't possible, or perhaps I'd been lucky. 10 years in, same. 15 years in, same. 20 years in, and there you've got proof that what I did in 2007, which is the first time I did it, is still possible in 2020. So that's something that I enjoy, because I enjoy trading. I love my job. I can't think of a better job for me to do. But being able to pull off a result like that sort of has that impact is something that I'm particularly proud of. But of course, coming to the end of Cheltenham, it was pretty obvious that sport was going to vanish. And as a consequence, we saw that happen. And there was no Grand National to follow up Cheltenham. There was no Tiger Roll to generate that spirit of enthusiasm for the big race of the year. And that was a little bit disappointing. And there was so much uncertainty around that period that was obviously sort of quite distressing to everybody, really. There's so much uncertainty. But it ushered in an interesting period because, I do like to structure my year so that at the end of the year, and usually in November or December, I go off and do something a bit special. That's my reward for working hard all the way through the year. And typically I would just do something a little bit crazy, a little bit out there. So I'll roam across deserts, go up mountains, climb volcanoes, I just do something completely different from what I do on my normal day-to-day life. And that wasn't possible this year. And one of the reasons that I do that is to sort of free my mind, really, just take myself out of the context of my normal life, as it were, and put myself in a new one. And all those times that I'm slogging away for hours to get to the top of some grand vista, it gives me plenty of time to think. You sort of sweat it out effectively. So that's what I typically do at the end of the year. Couldn't do it this year, which I've incredibly missed. But it was sort of forced upon me and everybody when we went into lockdown earlier in the year. And an interesting thing happened, because my first instinct was, I've got no pressure on me to do anything. Obviously, nobody was ordering BetAngel. There were no markets to trade. And suddenly I found myself in this sort of semi-retirement period that I've never experienced before. It was a test to see if I was ready for retirement. So I sort of went into the garden, sorted out the garden and started a couple of projects there. Got out on my mountain bike again and started hacking across the downs and, really starting to get super fit again. But then the interesting thing that happened, it wasn't that interesting, was that I really ruined my knee by overdoing it. And that meant that I just had to sit down. So there was no going in the garden, no going out on the mountain bike. I just had to sit down and watch movies and stuff. And I just was bored out of my mind. And the interesting thing was, what would tend to happen was I'd sit down and watch something and fall asleep because it was not stimulating enough for me. So eventually I just got the laptop out again and I just started playing around with ideas and looking at old data, tidying stuff up that I should have tidied up sort of months ago, and started playing around with stuff. But the thing I learned from that was that I'm definitely not ready for retirement. And also that by creating that space with no other distraction, I actually became incredibly creative. So I came up with loads of new things ready for when all of the sport was due to return. But a funny thing happened as well within all of this as well, in that there were a few sports hanging around. Belarusian football, some of the Australian racing, French racing was still around, German racing, US racing. There was little pockets of this occurring all over the place.
Und ich hoffe Ende der Saison auf Deutsch, but we try it now in English. Luca.
and people were betting on it. And I'm thinking, what are you doing? Why are you doing that? And it was beautifully summarized by a mock article, which was like, Tipster becomes international racing expert. And it was fascinating to watch this. I know that undercurrent is always there, that people want to have a few quid on something somewhere. But I just didn't realize just the extent of it. It was amazing how many people were suddenly participating in these markets. And the volumes were rising significantly. Now, the interesting thing is I had data on these markets from before, and I could now compare data on these markets now. And when you do that, the gap between the two contains information. So it's fascinating to be able to look at that and do that. And there were strange things that happened. So, for example, people started putting loads of money on Australian greyhound racing. And I just thought, what? Why are you doing that? Now, I'd had a greyhound, some automation on greyhound racing that I've run in the UK for some period of time. So I just took it and put it on the Australian greyhound. And it pretty much worked. It needed a little bit of tweaking because the markets are slightly different in terms of the way they behave and stuff. So yeah, I am now the proud trader of Australian greyhound racing. I've now become an expert in Australian greyhound racing, and that's something that's continued all the way through the year. So I've performed incredibly well this year, much, much better than I ever would have anticipated. But there have been a number of exceptionals because, the next US president market, 1.7 billion. I've become quite good at trading those types of markets. Political markets seem to appeal to a number of characteristics that I enjoy. So when I'm trading pre-off horse racing, you're trading opinion, and you're doing the same in a political market. And it's also, political markets are quite emotive, and we know, if you've been watching enough of my videos, that when people become emotional, they tend to do irrational things. So, that was an exceptional market as well. It just turned out to be sort of way bigger than I could have ever expected. But that's an exceptional and an unusual result, which will not repeat next year, and it wasn't available to me in the prior year. So you've got to add that on, Australian greyhounds. And there was a general bump in liquidity across all different types of markets. So when racing returned in the UK on June the 1st.
And the wait is over. They're all in. Good luck, everyone. They're off.
You look at the first race meeting that took place. It was an all-weather meeting in Newcastle. And the volumes that we saw on that particular day were astronomical as well. You're getting £1 million on some nothing all-weather race. So that was quite fascinating for me in terms of the way that the market behaved, what happened in each of these markets, and what people were willing to do in those individual markets as well. I'm sure it would have shaped a few opinions at the top level within the corporate bookmaker sportsbook structure as well, I should imagine. But we also had this fascinating period where football was played without any crowds. That created an immense opportunity that may or may not be around next season. I sort of hope it isn't around, because that means all the crowds are back and things are normal. And I would much prefer that than the current state at which we're in. Okay, I may never, it would be typical if Southampton have a great season this year and I never get to see them play. But, that was the first time in history. There'd always been these theories and papers and limited data sets on football without crowds. But now we have the definitive answer in terms of exactly what happens. I have done videos on this, and it will be interesting. The more data we get, the more accurate all of that will become. But it was funny because I often talk about, positive people see opportunity, negative people see problems. And at the beginning of the lockdown, I did say that there will probably be opportunities. And some of the things that I've listed here are the opportunities that were there. It was possible to be able to get new information, work in new markets, discover new things, either because you had the time on your hands all of a sudden, or because the markets behaved slightly differently from where they were before. And therefore, this is a classic example of, if you are looking for opportunities, you will find them. But I'm sure there are a lot of people that sort of just threw their hands up and just said, the world's coming to an end, let's sort of just do nothing. Or perhaps they didn't attempt to try and be creative during this period. But for me, it was really interesting because of the sudden lockdown and me ruining my knee. That gave me the opportunity to spend a bit of time on some new stuff. And as markets came in and I saw the characteristic of those markets, I was able to take that activity forward. So, gradually all of the sport did return and the markets began to behave pretty much like we would typically expect them to behave. That early £1 million races at Newcastle then slowly dwindled back to their more normal levels. But it was a fascinating period to be able to observe all of that and see the type of activity that occurred in those markets. So yeah, I've performed very well over the course of 2020, much better than I expected, but there were a number of exceptionals in there, which is why I'm sort of cautioning that that some of these things were unexpected overall in the scheme of things. But I think that one of the biggest lessons that I learned from 2020 was that, the markets change all of the time. When I first started, I started quite small and have built from there. I'm still getting better. I'm still learning new things. My limit really is the market itself. If the markets don't grow, I can't grow. So I have to find opportunities in other markets to be able to keep pushing forward. But even within those markets, they change fairly consistently all of the time. And I imagine that this time next year, they would have changed again as we begin to revert to sport, returning in a more normal sense. But one thing that I have learnt and has been reinforced with me in 2020 is that human nature never changes. And I think this is one of the big lessons I've learned in the last 10 years, is if you can understand people's motivation to do things and the way that they do them, then there's no reason why you can't build a career around that. Yes, you need to understand the markets. Yes, you need to learn to trade, and you have to have some strategies that you develop within that. But understanding human nature is one of the most critical factors, I think, in dealing with any particular risk markets, because people just don't behave exactly the way that they would typically anticipate. If you put some money at risk somewhere, it changes the way that people behave. And I think we saw that more than ever in 2020. But yeah, I hope that 2020 hasn't been too harsh on you and that we can all look forward to a better 2021.